I have a date tonight. 7 simple words drifted across the marble foyer, quiet enough that they should have disappeared into the evening air, yet powerful enough to bring one of the busiest households in Manhattan to a complete stop. Naomi Carter stood near the grand staircase with her coat folded neatly over one arm, her housekeeping apron already removed after another 12-hour shift inside the Romano estate. She spoke with the same gentle politeness she always carried, offering the schedule update to the head housekeeper with an apologetic smile. She had never asked for special treatment. She had never arrived late. She had never left a task unfinished. If anything, Naomi had become the invisible heartbeat of the mansion, quietly restoring order wherever she walked, leaving polished floors, fresh flowers, perfectly folded linens, and a sense of calm behind her. Across the foyer, Adrian Romano looked up from the leather portfolio resting on his desk. The city's most influential businessman rarely reacted to conversations among the household staff. He had built his reputation on discipline so absolute that even his closest associates struggled to read his thoughts. Yet this time, the fountain pen between his fingers froze in mid-signature. For the first time that week, the numbers printed across the contract in front of him no longer held his attention. His eyes lifted almost involuntarily toward the woman who had just spoken. Naomi didn't notice. She thanked the head housekeeper, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and glanced toward the antique grandfather clock as though worried about being late. That single glance unsettled Adrian far more than it should have. Late. She was worried about being late for someone else. The realization settled into the room with surprising weight. One of his attorneys continued explaining a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Adrian heard almost none of it. Instead, another question quietly appeared where business calculations usually lived. Who was she meeting? The thought irritated him immediately. It was ridiculous. Naomi was an employee. She had every right to spend her evening however she pleased. Her personal life had absolutely nothing to do with him. He knew that. He repeated it silently, almost like a courtroom verdict. And yet, as she smiled politely toward another member of the staff, something unfamiliar tightened across his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It certainly wasn't disappointment. Whatever it was, Adrian Romano disliked it on sight because he couldn't control it. Naomi reached for the front door, completely unaware that the simple sentence she had spoken had shifted the emotional temperature of the entire mansion. She had no idea that the man who negotiated billion-dollar agreements without raising his voice was now staring at the closed front door several seconds after she disappeared beyond it. One of the attorneys finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Romano?" Adrian blinked. The room returned. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. The fireplace crackled softly. Expensive watches ticked against expensive wrists. Every executive around the conference table waited for his decision. Adrian lowered his eyes toward the contract once more, but the carefully printed words seemed strangely distant. Without warning, the expensive fountain pen slipped between his fingers and struck the polished walnut desk with a sharp crack. A thin line spread across the barrel where the lacquer had fractured. No one spoke. They had seen Adrian negotiate impossible deals without showing the slightest emotion. None of them had ever seen him break a pen simply because someone mentioned having dinner somewhere else. The fractured fountain pen remained on Adrian Romano's desk long after everyone else had forgotten about it. His attorneys resumed discussing projections, signatures, and closing dates, but every number sounded strangely distant, as though someone had lowered the volume on the entire room. Adrian dismissed the meeting 15 minutes earlier than planned, an act so unusual that his executive assistant quietly checked the calendar twice to make sure nothing had changed. Nothing had. At least, nothing that anyone else could see. The mansion gradually settled into its familiar evening rhythm. The kitchen staff prepared tomorrow's breakfast. Ingredients. Security teams rotated shifts with practiced precision. Housekeepers finished their final inspections before heading home. Naomi Carter had become part of that rhythm nearly a year earlier. She never rushed through a room. She never complained about impossible schedules or demanding guests. She remembered everyone's coffee preferences, noticed wilted flowers before anyone else, and somehow managed to make a 40,000-square-foot estate feel peaceful without ever asking for recognition. The older employees adored her because she listened. The younger employees admired her because she encouraged them without making them feel small. Even the gardeners smiled when she carried lemonade outside during the hottest afternoons of July. She treated every person with the same quiet respect, whether they wore a tailored suit or work gloves covered in soil. Adrian had noticed all of it without admitting that he had. He knew she always arrived exactly 12 minutes before her shift began. He knew she hummed softly whenever she arranged fresh lilies in the east hallway. He knew she called her grandmother every Sunday afternoon from the small courtyard behind the greenhouse because the reception there was better than inside the mansion. None of those facts belonged in the mind of a man responsible for thousands of employees and countless business decisions, yet somehow they had settled there anyway. Standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study, Adrian watched the city lights spread across Manhattan like scattered stars. His reflection stared back at him, calm on the outside, unsettled beneath the surface. He had spent years mastering discipline, believing emotions only complicated clear judgment. Tonight, that certainty felt less convincing. His phone vibrated with a message from his chief operating officer asking for approval on an acquisition. Adrian read the message twice before realizing he had not understood a single sentence. Instead, another thought quietly returned. Was she laughing with someone right now? He immediately frowned at himself. The question was absurd. Naomi deserved evenings filled with happiness, friendship, and whatever future she wanted to build. He should have been pleased that someone as kind as her had found a reason to smile after work. So why did the idea leave such an unfamiliar emptiness behind? Downstairs, the head housekeeper finished reviewing tomorrow's assignments when Adrian unexpectedly entered the office. His voice remained calm, almost casual. Has Naomi requested tomorrow morning off? The older woman looked surprised before checking her notebook. No, sir. She will arrive at 7 sharp, just like always. Adrian nodded once. Good. He turned to leave, then paused with one hand resting against the polished oak doorway. I was only confirming the schedule. The head housekeeper smiled politely after he disappeared down the hallway, but she had worked in great houses for more than 30 years. She recognized many expressions on powerful men. Quiet curiosity was one of the rarest. The next morning arrived with the quiet precision that defined the Romano estate. At exactly 7 o'clock, Naomi Carter stepped through the staff entrance carrying a small canvas tote and a warm smile that somehow made the chilly autumn air feel less severe. She greeted the security officers by name, wished the kitchen staff a good morning, and immediately tied on her housekeeping apron before checking the day's assignment board. Nothing about her routine suggested that the previous evening had been extraordinary. She moved through the mansion exactly as she always had, replacing fresh flowers in crystal vases, straightening books in the library, and opening the tall curtains so the first rays of sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors. To everyone else, it was simply another ordinary workday. To Adrian Romano, however, ordinary had quietly disappeared. He tried to bury himself in work from the moment he entered his private office. Financial reports covered one side of his desk, while architectural plans for a new charitable community center rested on the other. Normally, he could review every page with remarkable speed, noticing even the smallest inconsistency without effort. Today, his concentration fractured every few minutes. Each time footsteps echoed beyond his office door, his attention drifted away from contracts and toward the hallway before he could stop himself. More than once he found himself listening for a voice that did not belong in his thoughts nearly as often as it suddenly did. Shortly before noon, Naomi entered his office carrying a tray with freshly brewed coffee and neatly organized correspondence. She performed the familiar routine with graceful efficiency, placing the porcelain cup exactly where he preferred it and aligning each document with perfect precision. Your 10:30 meeting has been moved to 11, sir, she said gently after confirming the updated schedule left by his assistant. Adrian looked up from the papers in front of him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Sunlight framed Naomi's natural curls with a soft golden outline, while the scent of fresh coffee filled the quiet office. She looked rested, peaceful, happier than she had the day before. That simple observation unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Did you enjoy your evening? The question escaped before he had time to reconsider it. Naomi blinked with pleasant surprise before smiling warmly. Yes, sir. Thank you for asking. It was very nice. She answered so naturally that there was no reason to doubt her sincerity. Yet those few words lingered long after she quietly excused herself and closed the office door behind her. Very nice. Adrian repeated the phrase silently. It was none of his concern who had made her smile that way. He knew that. Still, curiosity continued pressing against the disciplined walls he had spent years constructing around himself. By late afternoon, even his executive assistant noticed that something felt different. Adrian requested the same report twice without realizing it. He signed one document in the wrong place and apologized, something almost unheard of for a man known throughout the city for flawless attention to detail. As the assistant gathered the corrected paperwork, he hesitated before speaking. "Sir, would you like me to postpone your remaining appointments? You seem distracted today." Adrian slowly leaned back in his chair and looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun, filled with millions of lives unfolding beyond his reach. Somewhere inside that enormous city, Naomi had found people who made her genuinely happy. For reasons he still refused to name, that simple truth had become the most difficult business problem he had ever tried to solve. That evening, the Romano estate glowed beneath warm amber lights as rain clouds drifted quietly above the Manhattan skyline. Inside the mansion, every clock seemed to move with perfect confidence except the one inside Adrian Romano's mind. He had finished every scheduled meeting, approved every contract, and answered every urgent phone call, yet the uneasy feeling from the previous night had only grown stronger. Logic insisted that Naomi Carter's personal life belonged entirely to her. Emotion refused to accept that conclusion. Adrian walked slowly through the gallery overlooking the central foyer, pausing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows where he often gathered his thoughts after demanding days. Below him, staff members completed their evening routines with practiced efficiency. Naomi crossed the marble floor carrying a basket of freshly folded linens, stopping briefly to help one of the newer housekeepers reach the top shelf of a storage cabinet. She laughed softly after the younger employee thanked her, and that simple sound echoed farther than Adrian expected. It was genuine, unforced, the kind of laughter that came from someone who carried kindness naturally instead of performing it for attention. A few minutes later, Naomi returned to the staff office to clock out for the evening. Adrian watched her disappear around the corner before quietly calling his chief of staff. "Has Miss Carter requested any changes to next week's schedule?" The question sounded practical enough that even he almost believed it. His chief of staff reviewed the digital calendar before answering. "No, sir. Her attendance has been perfect as always. She only requested to leave on time yesterday." Adrian nodded once. "Very well." He ended the conversation, but instead of feeling satisfied, another question immediately replaced the first. Why had leaving on time suddenly become important to her? He disliked the direction of his own thoughts. Throughout his career, he had judged situations using evidence instead of assumptions. Yet tonight he found himself imagining possibilities with no facts to support them. Was she meeting the same person again? Had someone finally recognized the remarkable woman everyone inside the mansion had quietly admired for months? If so, that should have made him happy for her. Instead, he felt strangely left behind by a story he did not even belong to. He exhaled slowly and almost laughed at himself. The realization was impossible to ignore now. He was jealous, not angry, not possessive, simply jealous of time that belonged to someone else. The admission was so unfamiliar that he almost rejected it the moment it appeared. Adrian Romano had negotiated with presidents, philanthropists, and industry leaders without losing his composure. Yet one thoughtful housekeeper had somehow unsettled him simply by smiling at another part of her life. Downstairs, Naomi stepped outside the mansion carrying her canvas tote beneath the soft glow of the front entrance lanterns. She waved politely to the evening security team before walking toward the subway station a few blocks away. Adrian remained standing behind the window long after she disappeared into the rhythm of the city. He did not follow her. He did not interrupt her evening. He simply stood there in complete silence, realizing that the greatest mystery in his carefully ordered world was no longer hidden inside a business contract or financial report. It was hidden inside his own heart, and for the first time in many years, he had absolutely no idea how to solve it. Friday evening arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air, and Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of golden lights reflected across rain-darkened streets. Adrian Romano remained inside his office longer than necessary, staring at the city through walls of glass while convincing himself that he had no reason to leave. Every logical argument pointed toward staying exactly where he was. Every unexplained feeling urged him toward the opposite decision. Finally, he picked up his coat, instructed his driver to take the evening off, and slipped behind the wheel of one of the few cars in his collection that attracted almost no attention. He told himself he was simply going for a drive. Nothing more. Across town, Naomi Carter stepped out of the subway station wearing a simple navy blue dress beneath a light cream-colored coat. She carried no expensive handbag, no jewelry beyond a delicate silver bracelet, and no sign that she worked inside one of the city's most remarkable homes. She looked exactly like countless hardworking New Yorkers finishing another busy week, quietly looking forward to an evening with someone important. Adrian noticed her from across the street, but remained inside his parked car. The neighborhood was warm and welcoming, filled with family-owned restaurants, flower boxes beneath apartment windows, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. Naomi stopped outside a small Italian restaurant, checking the time on her phone before smoothing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A moment later, a tall man approached with an easy smile. He looked close to her age, dressed neatly in a charcoal jacket and dark jeans, carrying a small gift bag tied with a blue ribbon. Naomi's face immediately brightened. She hurried forward, and the two of them embraced with genuine happiness. Adrian's hands tightened around the steering wheel before he even realized he was gripping it. They laughed together as though continuing a conversation that had only been paused rather than forgotten. The man opened the restaurant door for her with effortless courtesy, and she thanked him with another warm smile before they disappeared inside. Adrian remained motionless, staring through the windshield at the softly glowing windows. He could see them seated near the front, talking animatedly while a server poured water into their glasses. Whatever they were discussing clearly brought Naomi joy. She leaned forward with sparkling eyes, listening intently before laughing again. Adrian looked away for several seconds, hoping distance would quiet the unfamiliar ache settling inside his chest. It did not. For the first time in years, success offered no comfort. The skyscrapers bearing his company's name suddenly felt meaningless compared with the simple happiness unfolding inside that modest neighborhood restaurant. He had spent decades believing that control solved every problem worth solving. Yet there was nothing to negotiate here, nothing to purchase, nothing to command. He could only watch from a respectful distance as someone else occupied the place in Naomi's evening that, without ever admitting it aloud, he had quietly wished might someday belong to him. After several silent minutes, Adrian started the engine. He did not interrupt their dinner. He did not step inside. He simply drove away beneath the glowing city lights, unaware that everything he believed he had just witnessed was only the beginning of a story whose truth was far different from the one his heart had already chosen to believe. The weekend passed more quietly than Adrian Romano expected, but silence did not bring clarity. Instead, it gave every assumption room to grow. By Monday morning, the Romano estate had returned to its familiar rhythm, and Naomi Carter moved through the halls with the same calm confidence she always carried. She greeted everyone with genuine warmth, carefully arranged fresh white roses in the entrance hall, and laughed softly with the kitchen staff while helping prepare trays for an afternoon charity luncheon. There was nothing secretive about her behavior. Nothing suggested she was hiding anything at all. Yet Adrian found himself studying ordinary moments as though they contained answers. Every smile seemed to confirm the story he had already written inside his own mind. Every glance at her phone became another piece of evidence supporting a conclusion he had never truly questioned. Late that afternoon, the mansion prepared to host several community leaders for a fundraising event benefiting military families. Volunteers decorated the ballroom, while caterers arranged long tables covered with crisp white linens. Naomi coordinated the final details with effortless grace, making certain every guest would feel welcome before they even walked through the front doors. Adrian watched from the balcony. Above, impressed once again by her ability to bring quiet order wherever she went. Just as the first guests began arriving, a familiar voice echoed across the foyer. "Naomi." She turned immediately, her face lighting up with unmistakable happiness. The same tall man from the restaurant stepped inside, carrying a carefully wrapped package tied with the same blue ribbon Adrian had noticed days earlier. Before Adrian could look away, Naomi crossed the foyer and embraced him again with obvious affection. Several nearby volunteers smiled at the touching reunion. Adrian felt the familiar weight settle in his chest once more. The man handed Naomi the package, and she laughed before gently shaking her head as though teasing him for bringing another surprise. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced an old photograph folded neatly inside a protective sleeve. Naomi's eyes widened. She covered her mouth, blinking rapidly as emotion softened her expression. Adrian could not hear every word from the balcony, but one sentence drifted clearly through the quiet room. Mom would have loved seeing us together again. Adrian frowned slightly. Together again. Before he could consider what that meant, an elderly woman standing nearby approached the pair with delighted surprise. "You must be Marcus," she said warmly. "Naomi has talked about her big brother for months." Adrian's heartbeat seemed to stop for a single, impossible moment. "Brother." The word echoed through his thoughts with stunning clarity. Marcus smiled politely and nodded. "I finally made it home. The deployment lasted longer than we expected, but I promised my little sister I would not miss another family celebration." Naomi reached over and squeezed his arm with unmistakable affection, the kind shared only by people who had spent a lifetime protecting one another through difficult seasons. Adrian remained perfectly still as every assumption he had built over the past several days quietly collapsed beneath the simple truth. There had never been a romantic rival. There had never been a secret relationship to envy. The dinner he had witnessed had been nothing more than a joyful reunion between siblings separated for many months while Marcus served his country. Standing alone above the ballroom, Adrian lowered his eyes, suddenly realizing that the only person he had misunderstood was himself. Adrian Romano remained on the balcony long after the applause welcoming the charity guests had faded into cheerful conversation below. The elegant ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers, yet the only thing he could see clearly was the truth he had refused to consider. Marcus had never been the mysterious man who had stolen Naomi's attention. He had simply been her older brother, returning home after months away, carrying family photographs instead of romantic promises. Every conclusion Adrian had reached had been built on assumptions rather than facts, and the realization settled heavily on his conscience. For the first time in years, he felt embarrassed not because someone had defeated him, but because his own imagination had quietly defeated his judgment. Throughout the evening, he found himself observing Naomi differently. She moved from table to table with the same quiet grace she always displayed, making sure every guest felt comfortable before thinking about herself. She introduced Marcus to volunteers with unmistakable pride, speaking warmly about his dedication and how much their late mother had admired his commitment to serving others. There was no hidden story, no secret relationship, only a brother and sister making up for months they had lost while life pulled them in different directions. Adrian realized how little he actually knew about the woman who worked in his home every day. He knew her routines, her professionalism, even the flowers she preferred arranging in the east hallway. Yet he had never asked about the people she loved or the life she had built beyond the mansion gates. Instead, he had allowed his own feelings to fill those empty spaces with fiction. After the event ended and the last guests departed, Adrian remained in the library while the household slowly returned to its normal evening rhythm. The leather-bound books surrounding him suddenly offered no comfort. His grandfather had once told him that true strength was measured not by how often a person was right, but by how honestly they admitted when they were wrong. Adrian had dismissed those words as youthful philosophy many years earlier. Tonight they returned with unexpected force. He quietly replayed every moment from the previous week. The broken fountain pen, the restless nights, the endless questions, the silent drive to the restaurant. None of those moments reflected the disciplined man he believed himself to be. They revealed someone uncertain, vulnerable, and deeply afraid of losing a place in another person's life that had never belonged to him in the first place. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Naomi stepped into the library carrying a tray with freshly brewed tea, assuming he was still working. "I thought you might like something warm before the evening ends, sir," she said with her familiar gentle smile. Adrian looked at her for several seconds before answering. There was no awkwardness in her expression, no sign that she suspected the emotional storm he had quietly created around himself. She was simply being thoughtful, exactly as she had always been. "Thank you, Naomi," he replied softly. As she turned toward the door, Adrian almost spoke again. He almost apologized for judgments she never knew existed. He almost admitted that the greatest mistake of the week had not been a business decision, but a personal one. Instead, the words remained unspoken. The library fell silent once more, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer carried jealousy. It carried humility, and Adrian Romano understood that before he could ever hope to earn Naomi's trust in a different way, he first needed to become a better man than the one who had quietly mistaken kindness for something he had the right to possess. The days that followed unfolded with a quietness Adrian Romano had never truly appreciated before. Instead of searching for answers that were never his to demand, he began paying attention to the things he had overlooked for months. He noticed how Naomi Carter always arrived a few minutes early to leave handwritten notes, encouraging the newer employees before their shifts began. He noticed that she never sat down until every elderly volunteer attending the estate's weekly charity events had been offered coffee or tea. He noticed that every act of kindness she performed happened when she believed no one important was watching. One rainy afternoon, Adrian walked through the conservatory connecting the east and west wings of the mansion. The glass ceiling echoed softly beneath a gentle shower, while rows of orchids filled the air with a light floral fragrance. As he rounded the corner, he stopped without making a sound. Naomi was standing beside one of the gardeners, helping him replant a small flowering shrub that had been damaged during the storm. Her sleeves were carefully rolled to her elbows, and a few specks of soil rested harmlessly against her hands. She smiled after the elderly gardener thanked her for staying a little longer to help finish the work before the weather became worse. "You always help everyone," the gardener said with quiet admiration. Naomi laughed softly and shook her head. "Someone helped me when I needed it most. I am only passing that kindness forward." Adrian remained hidden for another moment, unexpectedly moved by words she had never intended him to hear. Later that evening, after most of the household staff had gone home, Naomi returned to the library carrying a stack of books that had been left in the sitting room after a fundraising committee meeting. Adrian looked up from his desk as she carefully placed each volume back onto the shelves. Neither of them spoke immediately. The comfortable silence lasted several seconds before Naomi glanced toward him with a thoughtful smile. "May I ask you something, sir?" Adrian nodded. "Of course." She hesitated only briefly. "Did you happen to be near Mulberry Street on Friday night?" Adrian's heartbeat slowed. There was no accusation in her voice, only quiet curiosity. He considered denying it, but the impulse disappeared almost instantly. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I was." Naomi smiled with gentle understanding rather than surprise. "I thought I recognized your car as it drove away." Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment before meeting hers again. "I owe you an apology." Naomi tilted her head slightly, but remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I made assumptions that were unfair to you. I believed a story without knowing the truth, and I regret that." Her expression softened even more. She did not seem offended. If anything, she appeared touched by his honesty. After a quiet pause, she smiled with the same warmth that had first transformed the atmosphere of the mansion months earlier. "Sometimes our hearts tell stories before our minds have all the facts," she said gently. "It happens to all of us." Adrian let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. "You are being much kinder than I deserve." Naomi looked at him with calm, steady eyes. Kindness is easiest to give when someone is willing to admit they were wrong. The library fell silent once again, but this time the silence carried no uncertainty. It carried understanding. And in that quiet moment, Adrian realized that the greatest distance between two people was never measured in miles. It was measured in the courage it took to replace pride with honesty. Over the following weeks, something subtle began to change inside the Romano estate. It was not announced in company meetings or celebrated with grand speeches. It appeared in smaller moments that only attentive hearts could recognize. Adrian Romano no longer walked through the mansion seeing only polished marble, expensive artwork, and carefully managed schedules. He noticed people. He paused to thank the kitchen staff after long charity events. He learned the names of the seasonal gardeners. He asked employees about their families and actually listened to the answers. Those who had worked beside him for years quietly wondered what had transformed a man once known only for discipline into someone who now carried quiet compassion alongside quiet strength. Naomi Carter never mentioned their conversation in the library again. She treated Adrian with the same sincere respect she offered everyone else, never expecting special attention or recognition. Yet there was a new ease whenever they happened to meet in the hallways. Their conversations became a little longer, their smiles a little more natural, and the invisible wall created by status slowly began to disappear. One Friday afternoon, nearly a month after the charity event, Naomi finished arranging fresh white lilies in the entrance hall when she found a small ivory envelope resting neatly beside the vase. Her name was written across the front in Adrian's unmistakably careful handwriting. She looked around the quiet foyer before gently opening it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "If you happen to be free this Friday evening, I would be honored to invite you to dinner. No business, no expectations, just two people sharing a meal. If your answer is no, I will completely understand." Naomi read the note twice before a warm smile slowly appeared across her face. It was not the invitation that touched her most. It was the respect inside every carefully chosen word. Adrian had not assumed. He had not commanded. He had simply asked. That evening, after completing her final task, Naomi knocked softly on the open door of Adrian's office. He stood near the windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the sunset paint the skyline in shades of gold and amber. Turning toward her, he looked calmer than she had ever seen him. Naomi held the folded note in her hand and smiled. "I have an answer." Adrian nodded quietly, though his heartbeat felt far less composed than his expression suggested. Naomi stepped closer, her eyes bright with gentle amusement. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving beyond the glass. Taxis flowed through crowded streets, and countless lives hurried toward countless destinations. Yet inside the quiet office, time seemed to slow just enough for both of them to appreciate what had truly changed. This was never about a dinner reservation. It was about the journey that had made the invitation possible. Adrian had learned that admiration without humility becomes entitlement, but admiration guided by respect becomes something worth protecting. Naomi had discovered that genuine character reveals itself not when someone holds power, but when they choose kindness even after recognizing their own mistakes. As they walked out of the office, together toward the front entrance, the evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the marble floor where their paths had crossed so many times before. This time, however, they walked side by side, not because status had disappeared, but because mutual respect had finally become stronger than every difference between them. And on that quiet evening in Manhattan, the grandest lesson inside the largest house had nothing to do with wealth or influence. It was simply this: the strongest hearts are never the ones that refuse to change. They are the ones brave enough to change with grace.